Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the third day of Transform Health. My name is David Kenny, and I will be your MC for today's session on social media. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Theo Lynn today. Theo is Professor of Digital Business here at DCU Business School. Professor Lynn specializes in the role of digital technologies in transforming business processes. And Professor Lynn will be discussing some research conducted by himself and his colleagues titled Sorting the Healthy Diet Signal from the Social Media Expert Noise, Evidence from the #HealthyDiet discourse on Twitter.
Hi everybody and welcome to today's talk. Today I'm going to be talking about our research on using new forms of data analytics to identify the messages and who's influencing those messages on social media in relation to nutrition and diet. My name is Theo Lynn. I'm a professor of digital business at DCU Business School in Ireland, and this research was conducted with our partners in Brazil, UFPE and UFP. And just to make it clear, the research was funded partly by Safe Food, and Safe Food is the national health agency in Ireland for the whole of Ireland, so that's Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and they're responsible for communicating with the public around healthy food and diet. So we were particularly interested in exploring this particular topic because nutrition and diet are fundamental to the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN. So they have an important aspect of society. And so, promoting healthy lives and well-being for all parts of the community is a critical component. And obesity in particular is responsible for 4.7 million premature deaths each year. So it's a massive, massive problem. And it impacts not only society and on a personal level, it impacts the economy and our quality of life, etc. So when we think about it, interesting enough, as a particular type of illness, obesity affects the well-developed countries more than the less well-developed countries. So when we look at sub-Saharan Africa here, we can see that, well, they don't have particular obesity problems for a wide variety of reasons, including socioeconomic problems, etc. And because of that, it has a disproportionate impact on the economy. So we have these massive lost economic years resulting from obesity. It affects about 1.9 billion adults worldwide, okay? And when we think about this in the context of even our own lives, in Europe, 1 in 3 11-year-olds is overweight or obese. And this is particularly worrying for me. I have 3 kids. I have 2 daughters, one who's 10, one who's 15, and a son who's 13. And I look at the increasing prevalence of obesity. And often we look at the US and we say, oh, look, they have this massive obesity problem. But actually, when we look at Ireland, we're catching up there. And so this is a massive problem. And, it causes lots of other diseases. So it contributes to these things. It's a cause of cancer. When we think about COVID-19 right now, we know that people who suffer from obesity also are more likely to have more severe adverse impacts from COVID-19. So obesity is a massive problem in society. And as public health communicators, we're trying to persuade people to behave in a particular way or to adopt a particular behavior that we're interested in. And when we look at public health communications in particular, we tend to think about things in terms of, well, how will we persuade people to adopt more healthy lifestyles, to adopt more healthy diets? And it's very important at this point to say that diets aren't special diets where we restrict food, etc. Diets are a regime of eating, and we have a public health policy and we have guidelines to do that. It's a bit different than commercial marketers. So when I'm typically teaching digital marketing, I'm looking at consumers and I'm trying to persuade them at moments that influence their decisions on a particular product or service. And we're in this kind of loop. It used to be a very linear process. Now we have this continuous engagement with the customer where we're trying to influence them when they're gathering information or when they're shopping, or even after they've bought something, to try and get them and to persuade them to come around to our way of thinking. The difficulty with public health communications obviously is that could be incongruent for what they want. And so people want to eat particular types of foods, and we're trying to convince them not to do that. We're trying to convince them, well, look, a healthy lifestyle is better than eating this type of nutrition or food. And when we think about that, what we're trying to do is ask people to trust us. We're trying to persuade people, and trust is a very delicate thing, you know. So with trust, we have these three constructs where we're thinking of, well, trust relates to benevolence, that someone is acting in my best interest, that they're honest, that they have integrity. And third thing, which is really, really important, that they're competent. And that's a very big focus of what I'm going to talk about today, the competence of information sources on nutrition and diet, particularly on social media. And public health communicators, we have a particular challenge, because when we look at Edelman's trust barometer, and we look at whether people trust institutions in their countries, we see many of the countries where obesity is prevalent, and many of the developed countries, there is a lot of distrust. So, you know, when we look at Ireland, we're way down there at the bottom of the level, but look at France and Germany, the US, people distrust businesses, they distrust government, they distrust NGOs, they distrust a whole variety of different people. And the problem there is that when the general population distrusts what they're hearing from various information sources, it's very hard to persuade them to change their behavior. And that was before COVID-19. So in certain markets now, people are even more distrustful of health communications, or rather they get inconsistent messages from that. And so it's even harder and harder to get through the clutter. And when we think about what we're trying to do from a psychology perspective, you know, it's very much couched in this idea of persuasion and influence, and it goes back to the 70s and 80s when Robert Cialdini in Arizona State was doing this research, and he was finding that globally people are influenced by others who, when there is social proof, so when they see that other people are also being influenced by those, and that person has some kind of commitment and consistency to a particular position, that there's a reciprocation, so that, you know, when someone does something for me, I'm more likely to do something for them on the basis that I feel that I need to reciprocate, I need to give back, I owe them something, that I like them. So that liking and influence and persuasion are a key part of marketing. When we think about liking, we think it's a very nuanced thing. You know, I like them because I'm attracted to someone. I like them because they're witty or they're humorous. I want to be like them. So there's a whole variety of things around liking. Then obviously there's authority, and authority is a very important part of what we're going to talk about. And authority, you know, we think about government authorities, we think about health authorities, we think about doctors, we think about academic experts. And they have this inherent authority in their position. And then scarcity, you know, less relevant in this particular context, but scarcity is around this thing where something is rare, and we're more persuaded to do something if it involves something that's rare or scarce. And traditionally, due to a whole variety of reasons, but most likely due to the way traditional media was structured up until the 80s, you know, there was a pyramid of influence. So, you know, when we talk to Edelman, you know, Edelman in the past would have looked at how they advise people on PR by saying, well, you know, we have a CEO, or we have a president in the case of Mr. Trump, or we have a public health official, say Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. So we have all these people, and they're at the top of the pyramid, and they are communicating down to boards and then to academics and technical experts. And there's a whole variety of people who are relatively the elite, and they communicate to the mass media. And because up until the 80s, you know, there was relatively little media clutter, we largely trusted what we heard on the media and on the news, on TV, on radio, and that was how we got to the general population. So we would consume, as a consumer, we would consume information from these media sources, but as influencers, we would use these media resources to get large audiences. And then we get to the sort of the mid-90s, the evolution of the World Wide Web, and the emergence of blogging. And then on top of that, you know, when we get to the 2000s, we have social media. So suddenly it becomes incredibly easy for consumers to publish their opinion and to respond to content. And now we see the emergence of activists in their social activists, action consumers, employees in companies are able to influence people. And we suddenly see the population can draw from information sources, not only from the elite media and effectively experts and academics and executives, but they can also actually, they can get influenced by their peers, by their family, their friends, by micro-influencers. And together they create this pyramid of both a diamond of influence, which is a pyramid of community and a pyramid of authority. And together they come to influence our views. And that is particularly the case when it comes to social media. So the idea of influencers, which we talk about now, and it's nearly, it's conflated as social media influencers, but influencers have been around since the 50s. We have Katz and Lazarsfeld, and we have people talking about the two-step model of influence where, I'm influencing someone who then is influencing someone else. And at that stage, what's different is that those influencers could be described by what they know, who they are, and who they are connected to. And increasingly, that's been amplified or accelerated by social media, because the difference between the 1950s and the 1960s, 1970s, or between, I suppose, what was then influencers and opinion leaders and early adopters and market mavens to influencers, is that the difference is we have reach now. Whereas back then they were talking about relatively small reach or relatively large reach. So you had small reach within a community. Maybe you were a university lecturer and you had influence over people who attended your classes, etc. Or you had access to the mass media, and therefore you had reach to a quite large audience, whether locally or nationally. Today, you go to people who are not that active on social media, and they will still have hundreds of connections on Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or Twitter. And so they have this access to a wide, diverse group of people, and they have some passive and active influence in terms of those people's attitudes and behaviors. And when we think about these influencers, there's lots of different types. They're not just one type. So here we have apparently the most shared picture of all time, which is from the Oscars. And what this represents really is the mega influencers, the celebrities. These are the traditional influencers in the market. And they are still very important. And we like them because, they're interesting. We want to be like them. We might want to go out with them. We would like to be, we would like people to see us in the same kind of way. And they live lifestyles that we're interested in, or they portray characters in mass media, whether it's films or TV shows, that we would like to be associated with. We would like that lifestyle. And there's a lot of established research around source credibility with these types of mega influencers. And some of it's they're attractive, some of it they're trustworthy, some of it they have expertise. Now, I'm not quite sure what expertise they have other than acting, but often when we look at these influencers, they can portray expertise. But the key things here are they are attractive and they come across as trustworthy, which is somewhat ironic because that is exactly what their expertise is. Their expertise is in acting, so they can act trustworthy. They can act sincerely. They can act like they're reliable. Whether that's true or not is not the point. The point is they are perceived as that. And the key thing is, in many situations, they're relatable, and that's increasingly the case. So when we look at, this is the Hype House. Now, for some of you probably don't even know who these kids are, but these kids are all obviously somewhere between 13 and 17. The girl in the middle with the black tops is called Charli D'Amelio. These people have massive reach, and so they have 85 million followers on Instagram. They or TikTok, and what they do is they make or break music by creating dances to particular songs. So if they pick that song and get it out to their audience, particularly 10 to 15-year-olds will copy that song and they will record their own videos of them doing that song. And so they have this influence. What they influence people on is dancing and style and fashion and a variety of things, video games. But they have that influence, and people, particularly kids, can relate to those people. They look like them. They will wear clothes like them. They can say, oh, if those people are famous and they can make lots of money by just sharing dances, I can do that. And so that's a key part of their relatability. These are Norris nuts. If you're from Australia or you have kids around 9 to 12, these were a massive thing a couple of years ago. And they're an Australian family, 6 or 7 kids. And the parents, unashamedly market these kids and carve their lives as influencers. You go to their website, they're very clear that they're influencers. And they're sponsored by Mattel and Disney, but also food brands like Heinz and 7-Eleven. And when we look at this, they're influencing kids at a very formative part of their life. And they do lots of positive things and do sports and all kinds of stuff, but they also have these challenges where they'll just eat ice cream for the day, and then suddenly kids want to eat ice cream for the day, and they want to be like these kids. And what's very important is that even when we go back to the high pets and we look at someone like Charli D'Amelio, we forget that they're earning lots of money by being influencers on TikTok or Instagram, but they also have a support structure to do that. Or in some cases, they pursue very unhealthy habits, which will lead to adverse impact. So in the case of Charli D'Amelio, she had a diet and a lifestyle that resulted in getting a food disorder. And in fairness to her, she came out eventually and said, look, I had this food disorder and it's unhealthy, etc. But the point being is that people will copy her lifestyles, and it can lead to adverse outcomes. So we have the mega influencers who are famous celebrities, and they're famous through traditional media. Then we have these social media influencers, we call them micro influencers, and they're famous because of social media as opposed to traditional media. And then we have these what we call micro influencers or local influencers, and these are people just like you. I mean, these are people where a brand has identified someone not with a massive following, but they have a decent enough following. Maybe they have 2,000 or 3,000 people following them. And so in the case, say, of Daniel Wellington here, it's a Swedish watchmaker, they identify these influencers and they say, well, listen, we're looking for people who have cats, and we'll give you a watch. We want you to take a picture of your cat with our watch on your arm. And what they're doing is they're hitting Instagram influencers who have pets. And what they're trying to get is a niche and turn it into a mega niche by connecting all these small groups of followers and then getting reached by having their watch in every picture. Or if you take the case here of Cecilia Gorgon, a University of Michigan student, she worked with a skincare retailer, used their products, and used her reach to build awareness of the product over time. When you think about these things, influencing 8,000 to 10,000 followers at a time, or 2,000 followers, it's very quickly you build up the large audiences and relatively low cost awareness. And the key thing about how consumers interact with these particular influences, they don't equate social media with marketing. So they're not seeing these celebrities or the mega influencers or micro influencers. They don't see them as people trying to sell them things. They see them as cool or interesting or inspirational, or relatable, etc. So they see them in very personal terms, very subjective terms. Whereas we're standing back from this and saying, well, clearly they're trying to sell something. But in fact, if you're a follower or a kid, you just are interested in these people, interested in being like those people or being liked by those people in whatever way that might happen. And this is, you cannot underestimate the scale. All these people are highly influential in food things. So this is where we come back to obesity and food and influence. So this is PewDiePie. PewDiePie is one of the most successful micro influencer, mega influencers at this stage, who is famous totally comes from social media. He is famous for playing video games and talking about video games. And to give an idea of his lifestyle, for 3 or 4 years, he posted every day about him playing video games. And just to put into context, why do I have this picture here? He eats pizzas from the inside out, something that he learned from his grandmother. Now, that's a very particularly strange habit or behavior. And he also eats pizzas with a knife and fork, which I find a bit odd, but let's stick with the eating from the inside out, because that's very strange. And the key thing is, when he shot a video of him eating this pizza inside out, and it nearly broke the internet. Like 6-7 million people were sharing this video, or commenting on this video, or liking this video. 6 million people. This is about not him playing video games, him eating pizza in a particular way. And he has a reach of about 107 million people. That's his active reach. This guy has massive audience share. So these people, when they eat or what they eat, every part of their behavior is analyzed and discussed and shared. Now, if we go back specifically to the topic of, that's the context of, we talked about the topic of this particular talk. These two ladies are Australian. The first lady is Jess Anscoff, and the second lady here is Belle Gibson. And they're quite similar. And both were health and well-being influencers in Australia over a period of time, 4 or 5 years ago. And both claimed a particular diet, special diet, restrictive diet around vegetarianism would help cure cancer. So in the first case, Jess Anscoff claimed to have a particular type of sarcoma, which is can be relatively deadly. And in the case of Belle Gibson over here in the white, she claimed that she had a whole variety of cancers. And Jess Anscoff in particular, she was an editor on a teen magazine called Dolly, and she got diagnosed with cancer. She then pursued a particularly restrictive diet called the Gerson therapy. She developed a social media following around something called the Wellness Warrior, and I wouldn't say she had about 1.5 million followers. She was generating six-figure sums in terms of revenue. Following this type of diet regime, at the same time claiming that it was curing her cancer and avoiding, and this is particularly the case, avoiding traditional treatment for her cancer. At the same time, Belle Gibson came out with both a book and an app called The Whole Pantry, and again is focusing on a relatively strict diet. She generated, apparently up to $1 million in terms of her app and her book, and claimed that it cured terminal brain cancer. And now there's a couple of interesting points here. The first lady, Jane Anscoff, unfortunately succumbed to her illness and died. So it did not cure her cancer, okay? But she did have cancer. Interestingly enough, her mother also avoided traditional cancer treatment for breast cancer and also died. Belle Gibson turned out didn't have cancer at all. So she was a fraud. And so in her particular case is she even went to Jess Anscoff's funeral. She went out there, she was promoting a cure for cancer and didn't have cancer. So there was no efficacy about these treatments, promoted this restricted diet, generated lots of revenues. And then it was turned out that it was fraud, and she was sued by the Consumer Council in Australia. Ultimately went bankrupt, was in debt for $500,000 or something like that by the end, and is now apparently claiming that she's been adopted by an Ethiopian tribe, the Oromos, but it turns out that that may not be true either. So they highlight two things. In the first instance, someone sincere and passionate is promoting a very restrictive diet, a strict organic vegetarian diet to cure a deadly disease. A disease suffered by many, many people who are desperate for any hope, okay? But is not based on scientific evidence. The second, it's all fraud. So she's promoting a particular dietary regimes on the basis of a fraudulent claim. So it's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's all the bad things we can think about the internet. And they influence millions of people and they profited from it, okay? And so this idea of poor quality sources of information on the internet is a very real thing in this particular case. And when we look at the research on health information on social media, it's very clear it's not subject to the same degree of filtering and quality control as in traditional scientific media. So there are no professional gatekeepers, no editors. So it's prone to being out of date, incomplete, and inaccurate. And when we look at the research, and the research uses relatively small data sets, might be a couple of hundred Facebook profiles, or it might be a couple of relatively small numbers of Twitter profiles or small timeframes. What we see is that people are influenced by everyday influencers, their families, their friends, etc., by micro, professional, macro, and celebrity influencers, including ones who are celebrities because of traditional media and celebrities because of social media. And then they're also influenced by fake influencers. So we see some limited research on fake influencers on social media around health. This is particularly the case you see in terms of the anti-vax movements. We see a lot of manipulation in that particular movement. But what we can hypothesize from when we read this research is that largely health information influencers on social media are inadequately qualified. So the vast majority of them are not qualified nutritionists, dietitians, doctors, or health professionals. Secondly, they present opinion as facts. So they often conflate their opinion with scientific evidence. Thirdly, often their recommendations, like the Gerson therapy, is presented contrary to nutritional guidelines, or in some cases, treatment guidelines for something like cancer. And finally, we see that there's evidence of manipulative or deceptive marketing techniques, using bots, using particular types of claims, etc. And what the impact is people delay or do not seek legitimate medical treatment. So in the case of both those Australian ladies, what we see is other people followed their diets and they made decisions not to be treated using conventional techniques. In the case of Jess Askov, her mother died because she didn't take normal treatment for cancer and breast cancer. It also results in malnutrition. So people are restricting a particular type of food type and therefore may do without a particular nutrients that they need. And then the key thing is it interferes with sound nutrition education and public health. We know that is fact. There is all this noise and it's increasingly difficult for public health communicators to get their message across. So that's a massive problem. And, when we talk about the digital society, here's a situation where the digital world influences the physical world in a very real sense. So what we want to know in our research were, who are the most influential users in the healthy diet discourse on Twitter? What are the most prevalent topics and subtopics in that discourse? And we want to look at a sustained period, so over 12 to 16 months, so that we actually could see, well, what's the seasonality of that discourse and how does it change? And then the third thing, and this is a bit further out, is how effective was deep learning for identifying high quality and low quality nutrition and diet information sources and content. So we wanted to be able to identify, oh, that Twitter user is reliable and high quality, and that Twitter content is reliable and high quality, or it's consistent with public health guidelines. So what did we find out? Well, first of all, we use Twitter, and I think it's really important to understand why we use Twitter. Well, first of all, despite rumors, it has a very large monthly active user base. So all over the world, it still has hundreds of millions of people using Twitter every day. It's open. So there's a couple of important things about an open social network, is that influence spreads further. And the second thing is, people are not limited by who they follow. On Facebook, I have a relationship with people and I follow them and they follow me back and we can talk to each other. On Twitter, the key thing here is a social network that is largely made up of strangers. Most of the people I follow, I don't really know. So can I say I have a relationship with, I don't know, Dr. Fauci? No, I can't, okay? It's mostly text-based, so it allows us to do quite a lot of analysis. And it's short messaging. So even though you can have up to 280 characters, it's mostly somewhere around that 100 to 200 character limit. It uses hashtags. So hashtags are important because it allows people to form communities around that hashtag as opposed to around people. But it also means that people can follow and self-report and self-describe the content that they're putting out there. A key part is it's available data. So in DCU, we have a license with Twitter, so we can get the historic Twitter data all the way back to the beginning. And for each tweet, we can get up to 160 pieces of data. So we'll get quite a lot of data. And I suppose in the context of this particular research, it's widely used by health professionals and it's widely used by consumers for health information discovery. So in our particular space, that we're looking at today, we know that this is a source of influence and information. So the data that we looked at was historic and ran from January 2018 to April 2019. And what we wanted to do there was get a full year of data and then an extra 3 to 4 months so that we could validate some of our models on separate data. It's about somewhere in the region of 635,000 users, about 7,500 verified users. So verified users are users that Twitter has specifically validated that who they are and that they are authentic. And so when we look at that, it's also broken down into original tweets, so people who tweeted, and then how people engage with it. So did people share it, so retweets, or did they engage some other way in terms of replies? That's when people are having a conversation. And you can see that with verified users, they have a lot more replies, but a less percentage of retweets in general. Also, when we look at the seasonality here, you can see that there are specific peaks, in this case around August and January. And of course, that reflects what we anecdotally know, that people are more focused on diet when they're going on holidays, when they have to look good, but also directly after Christmas, where maybe they've eaten too much, or after, in the case of America, after Thanksgiving. So you eat too much, and then what you want to do, you talk about diet a lot more. You're more interested in getting back in shape in the new year. Who are the most influential users in the healthy diet discourse? Well, a couple of things is, there's a sort of an inverse relationship between active users and visible users. So active users are people who tweet a lot, and then they have replies and retweets. So it's a combination of number of tweets, number of replies, number of retweets. Whereas visible accounts, it's just replies and comments. So these are people who are being shared a lot. And what you notice is that the most active users, and when I say they are active, they are sharing a lot, okay? And thousands of tweets. They are typically not verified. So other than the South Beach diet here, you can see if I look at this list of 20 or 30, top 30, there's only one verified account. And what we do when we analyze that to on a much larger scale, what we found was about 6% of the data set was spam accounts or suspended accounts, right? So first of all, there's a lot of spam there. Second of all, most of these users use advanced software for communication. So they're using proprietary designs, bots, or they're using enterprise marketing tools to automate their Twitter feed and respond. More visible accounts, you can see that there's a lot more verified accounts there. And that's critically important. So what we can say is that the accounts that are verified as being specific, authentic accounts, and you can see there that there's FLOTUS, Melania Trump, there's the World Health Organization, the FAO, there's the Cleveland Clinic, the hospital, etc. So we can see the NHS is in there. So we can see that, yeah, that makes sense. The visible users are these relatively well-known accounts. But what we also see is they're not as active. So they don't feature on our active users. So one of the things is they're not as active. And the key thing is they're probably not talking about nutrition and diet all the time. So nutrition and diet are not their primary topic. It's something that they talk about occasionally, but they're in the data set. Now, when we boil down to what are they talking about, what we find is that there's a big difference between spam accounts and verified users, okay? So if we look at the overall number of original tweets, what we see is, well, we get some interesting topics pop up around disease and more importantly, fat. So what we see when we think about the overall discussion is we see a lot of the content that has the spam and bot accounts in it focus on fat. They focus on weight, and they focus on how a particular special diet can change your lifestyle, your quality of life, cure you in various things. So they have a lot more persuasive language. If we take out all those spam and low quality accounts, actually what you get is the overall content looks more like the verified users. which is more consistent with health guidelines. It talks about being healthy, it talks about exercise, fitness and workout a bit more, it talks about nutrition more, and less about fat, okay? And so we're using LIWC to analyze this data. And you can see whether we take the health dictionary or the ingest dictionary or the body dictionary, you get the same kind of thing, you know, where we're, you know, fat is always slightly more inflected when we talk about the spam or multi-level marketing companies or commercial accounts versus verified users. Now, we then boil down and see about diets. Maybe that one can tell us something. And what we found was two big clusters. What we find is that largely co-occurring popular diets revolve around either low carb, carb-free, high protein diets, you know, the keto diet or the Atkins diet, etc., or vegan, vegetarian worldviews, okay? And what we find is that low quality accounts really come into play here, and they're pushing these two lifestyles, particularly in the case of low carb, carb-free. So, you know, it's funny when we go back and we see the verified account, the South Beach diet, even though it is and promotes a low carb diet, it isn't as prominent when we look at it in the data set. However, when we look at it from a network analysis perspective and see, well, who is really drawing attention here? And we can go back to the literature. Now, Katz, even in the 50s, is talking about how influencers have a strategic social location, right? And we look at the network analysis for the entire data set. We find that we have 114,000 nodes or users, and we have 77,000 edges. So this is how people are replying to that particular user. And we see that the network diameter is 31. So we're saying that, you know, up to 31 steps away people are. So it's highly sparse. So people are not that connected in the overall health network. So in one sense, it's very hard to market in that network because really people aren't that connected, or the degree to which they are connected isn't that great. So maybe we can boil down, maybe there's a subnetwork. So in fact, we do find clear subnetworks. So the largest subnetwork is very distributed, very general. So we can largely ignore that. But then when we get down to the next largest network, what we find is a structure around one key influencer, South Beach diet. So the South Beach diet attracts about 96% of this community's discussion. So it's very centered on this particular diet. And there you can contrast using activity and visibility versus network analysis. Network analysis is showing us that this particular diet is communicating very effectively within its group. And then we go to the third largest subcommunity, and we get to vegan diet and lifestyle. So actually, when we think about who is influential, we're saying as well, the vegan community is much more cohesive than other communities, and the South Beach diet community is very cohesive, right? So, but that reflects again the general trend that we found when we looked at diets is that low carb, carb free, and vegan, vegetarian, those two communities are reflected. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at these, the South Beach diet community is about half the size of the largest community. So it's about, you know, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 users. What about traditional media and public health communications? Well, not so great news there. So the fourth largest community and the fifth largest community are either media centered or public health organized. And you can see straight away that they are not coordinating each other. So it's very spread out, okay? And it's not that active. So that visualization gives us an indication of the challenge we have is that their influence is dispersed, okay? Now, so what do we know from our basic analytics is that, well, there is an active discourse on Twitter. We know that we found evidence of lots of bots. So what we used to find out was that University of Indiana botometer, and we're able to run that API on all the data to identify the probability that something a bot or not. So we know that there's bots, we know that there's very sophisticated marketing tools being used. We know that there's two very large diet discourses, vegan, vegetarian, low carb, carb free. And we also know that there are sub-networks and sub-communities within that network that are very active, but public health and media are not the main influencers, or their influence is lessened in those particular communities. What's worrying about the vegan and low carb, carb free diet influencers is that in both those cases, you will find that the scientific evidence to support those diets in all cases, and when I say in all cases, is for people in general, is inconclusive at best. So, you know, you can't literally say, you know, a carb-free diet is great for everybody, or a vegan diet is great for everyone. It might be good for some people, but it's not good for everybody. In fact, in the case of high protein, low carb diets, there's some evidence that there are adverse effects for many people, okay? Now, what we're then interested in is, well, we have this massive scale problem really, because there's all these people talking about 100,000, 200,000, 600,000 people talking about nutrition and diet, let alone all the other health topics. And so how easy is it for us to identify high quality and low quality sources of information and content? So one of the things that we were interested in exploring is how can we use deep learning? And deep learning is a subset of machine learning, which is self-learning. So, you know, we train it to identify high quality and low quality sources of content. And then we have a training set. And then over time, we feed it more data and it learns from its analysis. So in one sense, what we're doing is we're extracting some features. In this case, what we used is 3 qualified nutritionists who identified whether the biography or profile data identified whether someone was a nutritionist, dietitian, doctor, etc. And B, whether particular tweets were in line with national health guidelines. And so they created a trained data set where they tagged that up, and we had an intercoder reliability, which was quite high. And then we fed that into the deep learning models. So we trained a deep learning model, in this case LSTM, on that data. And what we're trying to identify is whether something is high quality or low quality. So is it high quality or not, or is it reliable or not, okay? What did we find out? Well, first of all, our deep learning models, and in this case we use LSTM, performed very well. So, you know, what we had was a time series data with high dimensionality. So it had a lot of different features in it. And so LSTM and BiLSTM was the appropriate model we felt to use there. We got very high accuracy, very high sensitivity. Our specificity score wasn't great, but our precision and F1 scores were very good. So overall, we felt that, look, we got very good model scores. So our deep learning was performing well for both types of classification, okay? Based on the training data set, that's very important. And what we found was that our deep learning model, after we trained it, okay, was 96% accurate. It classified 96% of sources of content as low, or profiles as low quality, and 79% of content as low quality. Now, they're very damning figures when you think about it. So just to be clear what the process was, we coded up several thousand profiles as qualified or not qualified. We coded up content as high quality or low quality. We then trained the deep learning model how to recognize high quality, low quality, and then we gave it real data. And with the real data, and it was 80-20, so 20% was trained data set, and 80% was the real data set. And what we find is 96% of profiles are low quality and 79% of content is low quality. So most of the content in that discourse is noise, okay? But that's not the only story. What we find when we get back into it is the DL performed well against the training data set. So the deep learning is working well in a theoretical or lab way. But when it gets into the reality, we find lots of well-known accounts are classified as not reliable or low quality. So we can see here the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, NHS, they're classified incorrectly. And when we get into their content, we can see that some of their advice is classified incorrectly. And so what is the problem there? And the problem there is the profiles that many of these verified accounts or highly qualified accounts use doesn't reflect qualifications. It doesn't say we are qualified to talk about something. And in this case, we are qualified to talk about nutrition and diet. And often the content is not sufficiently clear to say that this is nutrition and diet information that you should follow. So for instance, in many cases, the deep learning is correct, and this person does not give us the data to say that they are qualified in nutrition and diet. And they may not use the words in their tweets that say this is content that you should follow and is inconsistent with guidelines. But in one sense, while that is true, it is not necessarily correct. So deep learning is not a panacea for this, or rather our deep learning model needs more work, okay? So what's the net result of all this? Well, I think there's some high level takeaways which are really important in the context of digital society and health and digital society. And this is primarily aimed at, I think, health communicators and policymakers. Number one is it's not a question of just being out there and on Twitter. You have to be both active and visible. You know, public health communicators are competing against a massive deluge of noise caused by multi-level marketers, commercial companies, special diets, proponents of worldviews like veganism, etc. And to achieve prominence, health, nutrition, and diet professionals need to be both more active and more visible. So they need to be out there promoting stuff, not occasionally, all the time. And they need to be interesting, relatable, and credible. And what do I mean by that is that the content needs to be on message, and they need to be interesting and fun and credible and targeted. And there are lessons to be learned from the hype house and Norris Nuts and mega influencers and the multi-level marketers, etc. And it's that point in time that they need to be looking at the images, and they need to be looking at the persuasion attempts and the messaging and the content they use, so that it's relatable to the target audiences that they're aiming at. And people are looking for advice. So the people who are out there looking for diets for cancer, they have to be putting that content out there in a way that that content is accessible quickly. On the other hand, they need to have different types of content that appeal to, you know, under 10s, tweens, teenagers. They need to be on Instagram. They need to be saying, well, what kind of content can I share on Instagram that will attract new audiences or the general audience? They need to be coordinated and sophisticated. So what we're seeing is, oh, these people are using bots. They're using network analysis. They're using influencers. They are using enterprise marketing techniques. They are coordinated. So you look at South Beach Diet, they are building a community around themselves and leveraging that audience to get reach. And so equally, when we look at SC5, the subcommunity 5 there, we can see that, well, actually, the public health organizations are not coordinated. So we need a more coordinated and sophisticated approach to public health. I suppose in the same way that we can see in America how politics has become much more coordinated and sophisticated in terms of how they do political online communications. We need the same thing in public health. And so to compete for share of voice and ideally trend, public health organizations need to make sure that they are coordinating not only locally with their stakeholders, with dietitians and influencers, no matter what the size of those influencers, but they're doing that internationally, right? Because our kids, our families, our loved ones, our friends are all consuming content, not just from their own country, but globally. And so actually what needs to happen is the public health communicators need to say, look, we need to run coordinated campaigns and reshare our content and retweet our content or reply to our content so that we're leveraging each other's reach and each other's impact to get things to trend and to stay prominent in the discussions. But we also need to use these enterprise techniques. We need to be using auto scheduling. We need to be making sure that we are leveraging as many of these new technologies and software technologies so that we are marketing our message more. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the role of platforms and policy. So there are lots of bad actors out there. We're saying that there's lots of spam, lots of bots, lots of misinformation, okay? And then there's deceptive behavior. We see fake blogs, we see smoke screening, we see, even we can see some evidence of political actors in things like anti-vaccination campaigns where they're trying to cause tension between different groups, okay? And that requires intervention by platforms and policymakers. You know, we talk about your money or your life. And when we're trying to counteract misinformation and disinformation, we know that specific types of techniques work. And that includes early warnings. So when a post comes up and it includes misinformation or disinformation or messages that is counter to public health policy and therefore may result in adverse health effects, we know because of COVID-19 that these platforms can take action if they want. They can put up notifications, they can stop those messages going out, they can put signals on Twitter, they can respond with additional content. And the key thing is they have to choose to do that. And whereas they do that for some political situations and COVID-19, they don't do it for nutrition and diet. And therefore, policymakers need to decide what intervention should they have to make this happen? What platforms can they use? And to do that requires a dialogue between the platforms and the policymakers and the platforms and public health communicators and officials to ensure that this happens. Because in the same way that there are many bad actors, spreaders of misinformation and multi-level marketers, deceptive marketers out there in politics or extremism, there is the same thing in public health. And we talk about COVID-19, and that is critically important right now. But the obesity epidemic has been ongoing for decades, and it's getting worse. And so it's an important part of digital society that we sit down and think is, what is the role of platforms in countering bad behavior in health and discourses? And what is the role that policymakers need to have in terms of the relationship with these platforms in terms of the public health discourse? And the slightly worrying thing is obviously that Facebook in particular feels, and they're very influential, they feel that, well, they don't believe that they should have that role. They shouldn't be in a position of being the arbiter of truth. But in this particular case, it has a real adverse effect on people's health and well-being. And to do nothing is not the right thing to do. And in that particular case, we need to think as, are we doing the right thing? And if it involves people's money, life, freedom of speech, etc., these are all very important things. But what we have a tension here is between freedom of speech and quality of life. That effectively any kind of health misinformation that adversely affects the public health or of large groups of people worldwide needs to be taken seriously. And platforms have responsibilities to do that, and they should be held accountable for that. And that's a controversial statement. But the reality is that the technologies and solutions to provide warnings that this information may not be scientifically validated is out there. We've seen that with COVID-19. We've seen that in the politics. So these platforms can do that if they want. We're using deep learning on a sophisticated level from an academic perspective, but compared to the Facebooks and the Googles and the Twitters, you know, they have deep learning and machine learning capabilities, which would allow them to identify this content, poor quality content, very quickly, and put up warnings or put up counter warnings or remove content over time. but do they have the willingness to do that? Do they want to do that? I'm not so sure. They might say, well, we have freedom of speech. We get lots of advertising for these people. There's a whole variety of discussions there. But the reality is a discussion needs to happen about the role of social media platforms in public health, and what should civic society and policymakers who are representatives in civic society do to ensure that the balance between freedom of speech and quality of life in terms of public health is maintained. So thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed today's talk, and enjoy the rest of the week. See you now. Bye.
Thank you very much, Theo. I suppose in keeping with tradition at this point, I will look at some questions that were posed during your talk. So only the one question. So before I post this, just a reminder to everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, you use the Q&A button down the bottom. It's not done through the chat function. Okay, it's done through the Q&A. So one question here, it's actually, Theo, it's on regulation. So I'll put it up.
And I see it there. Okay,
yeah.
so there's a couple of different approaches to this. So you see the approach that's taken right now in the elections, for instance, that the platforms are, if they want, okay, the platforms can play a role in moderating whether that content is put out. So there's a couple of different things. The difficulty with sharing misinformation or disinformation or poor quality kind of information is that counteracting that after the fact reaches less people and has less impact. So what you need to have is warnings at the time of publication, or really what is initial exposure, because we don't know whether people read it. We just know they're being exposed to a piece of content. And so the ways that happens currently is that platforms are identifying this with machine learning, and they decide not to put out the content, or a disclaimer appears with that content. So you can see that currently in the COVID-19 case in the States, where if a politician or public official comes out and they say something that is contrary to scientific fact, the Twitter might take it off, or they might put a notice comes across it. The other way of doing that is counter stories, so that actually the platform voluntarily publishes more content to counter that type of discussion, so that people are aware of that. The key thing here is that the way regulations are set up is that the platforms are largely immune from what people say on the platform until such a point that something negative happens, or policymakers intervene. So the issue here is, at what point does a policymaker intervene? And it's quite difficult. Obviously we want Facebook and Twitter and everything to be located in Ireland, and largely I think that they're a force for good in terms of socialization, etc., particularly right now when we're all isolated or whatever. But on the other hand is, without a doubt, poor quality information is being spread very easily to large audiences, whether it's in health, finance, money, politics, etc. And at some point in time, there has to be regulations to curb the adverse effects on this. So that's what I would say there. Now I go, when food companies fund research papers on diets, is this a problem? So yes. So Gregory, I think any corporate entity that is funding research, you have to clearly state who they are. So when I started off, I said Safe Food, which is it's not a food company, it's a public health communications agency. if you're trying to sell a product and you're funding research on that product, obviously there's research ethics involved in that. When you look at it more deeply, if you take the tobacco industry in particular, they've funded their own journals to get around that. So I think that there's that's something that actually there are research ethics around it. I think the difficulty is, and we see this again with COVID-19, that the research suggesting that it was a designed disease from China seems to have been funded by some Republican groups. I think the issue is academic publishers go through a review process, and you have other people reviewing. In the context of social media, you can put this content out, and as the ISPs, the internet providers, or social media providers, they hide behind that shield. So I think that the key thing there is there has to be some kind of policy intervention with the platforms, but equally that's not that politically easy to do because they employ a lot of people, and it's a freedom of speech thing. So what you have is a tension between freedom of speech and public policy in relation to health or politics, etc. And that tension is different in different countries. Chris is asking, is there education in schools to show the reality of influencers as you displayed in the first part of your presentation? The answer to that is no. It's very sporadic. In fact, one of the recommendations that we came out of our project is there's two types of literacy that we need to develop. One type of literacy, exactly as Chris pointed out there, is exploring what it means to provide information literacy to kids. And actually, I don't mean kids, that's incorrect. Information literacy to the public, but starting earlier in school. So kids are increasing on the internet very early. They certainly are getting their phones now 10, 11, 12. But I think that actually that information literacy goes all the way through secondary schools and into higher education. And frankly, for older people, it's the same thing. We didn't grow up with social media, etc. So, there's a cultural side that we need that information literacy and digital literacy. The second side, which you do not see discussed as much, is the idea of digital health literacy. And digital health literacy is very different than health literacy. So you see an increased focus in schools on teaching kids about nutrition and diet, etc. But what you don't see is the combination of those two things, information literacy and health literacy, what we call digital health literacy. So digital health literacy is something that's very undercovered and underinvested in. And in particularly, as we consume more and more content from social media and the internet, combined with that, our television or our media consumption has changed. So we're not consuming as much traditional terrestrial television as we did. And we're not consuming newspapers as much as we did, or even periodicals. And our society is being influenced by influencers and a whole variety of different social media. I think there is an onus on us to think about not only information literacy and health literacy, but this intersection of the two, digital health literacy. And in that context, again, and the wider thing is digital civic literacy. So understanding that context, because I think it all comes together. Do you think the trend of social activists influencing our food choices will eventually run its course, similar to influencers promoting brands in exchange for payments? Well, you know what? I'm conscious that most of the audience who participate or sign up to listen to these types of webinars are what we would call an informed public. So you're probably more advanced than the general public. So we tend to overestimate that people identify that they're being influenced and that someone's promoting brands for money. The reality is, again, we go back to this point, people don't care that the Kardashians are being paid to promote something. They just want to be like a Kardashian, or they want to be like, if you're 12, you want to be like Norris Nuts, and you want to be popular, and you want to be relatable, and you want to look nice, and you want people to talk about you. And So I go back to this thing is that, yes, you can say, oh, those people being paid and you shouldn't take it seriously, but people still aspire to be those people. You know, George Clooney goes on and we see him drinking espresso. At the end of the day, people want to be George Clooney, or they want to, you know, or they want to make love to George Clooney, or you know, whatever it is. You know, so you know, Brad Pitt, same thing. Is Brad Pitt's driving a car, wearing a watch? We want to be like Brad Pitt. So there's a whole variety. I mean, it's not that simple to think that it will run its course, because we're constantly being influenced, and sometimes it's not by brands. And this is the key thing: is if you take the two influencers to their strengths, particularly Jay Sanders, she was sincere. She was trying to cure her cancer, and she believed in the efficacy of this particular diet. The fact that that diet, there was no evidence to substantiate the claims that diet would cure her cancer. That's what she believed. So she wasn't being paid to do it. She was making money out of the fact that she was trying to do something. And so the sincerity that she has, different in the context of something like the veganism discourse, those people are passionate about veganism. That's their worldview. And veganism isn't just food, it's clothes, it's cosmetics, etc. So it's a wider worldview. And so I don't think influencers are just going to disappear. I just think that they'll move to a different channel and platform. And we see that all the time. It's, you know, all the way from the 50s to today. If you look at Patreon, you know, we have a client who trains sheepdogs, and some people will say, oh my God, it's cruelty to animals, it's training a sheepdog. But the reality is he's an expert at training sheepdogs. And there might be 50 to 100 people in Ireland who might use his services. But worldwide, there might be tens of thousands of people. And now he makes a living on Patreon advising people how to train sheepdogs, okay? And he is an influencer in the sheepdog community. And I think that there are mega niches worldwide that the internet allows us to combine these really small niches, local niches, into these massive markets. And it is not that influencers and influencing will run its course. It's that the nature of influencing will change, and the nature of who's an influencer will change. So I it's a very complex problem. What we can say is that when Katz and Lazarsfeld did their study, they were talking about influencing like 10 to 15 people. These days, we're talking about, even at a micro level, you might be influencing hundreds of thousands of people each week through Instagram or something. So when I go to Brazil or I go somewhere, I'm always tweeting or showing, posting pictures of food. Do you know what I mean? And that influences people. You might not think it does, but we're all, if we interact with people, we're influencing them to do something or not do something. You know, there's always kind of influence behaviors going on. Peter is suggesting that the Tory party have the knowledge to take down the BBC. What do you think is the role of a credible, authoritative state broadcaster? Well, I think it's a good thing. But you know, I think that what we found in Ireland versus the US is that the media as a whole here still adhere to the idea of the fourth estate and the principles of that, where they're objective. And then you have opinion pieces, but largely they're objective and report two sides of a story. And I think that you find that in the BBC, and I think you find that in RTE, etc. I think on the other hand, in the States, where there was this deregulation of the news sector so that you didn't have to have a balanced point of view, that fundamentally changed how news is delivered in America, particularly on TV. So it's very, very different. In fact, one of the things that we did find is some of the doctors of Fox News are also some of the doctors who are promoting low carb, high protein diets. So it's kind of interesting that Fox News intersects there. But clearly the whole point about having a public broadcaster is so that a community can have an objective source of information that is not influenced to the same degree. Now, any time where there is the suspicion of influence by a government or commercial interests, etc., obviously that degrades the trust. And it goes back to trust. So that, when we're talking about Peter's comment here about a credible, authoritative state broadcaster, what we really mean there is that that broadcaster is acting in our best interests, that they have integrity, and that they're competent. So they're competent journalists, they act with it. So it really comes down to who they put on the air. Do you know what I mean? So, so the role of a broadcaster in that context is to present different points of views and to challenge those arguments so that as a society we are better for that. So I think that, giving the example of Operation Transformation, I think that largely that's a very positive thing. And so I can understand how RTE would broadcast that over a series of things. And I can understand its popularity because people do want to lose weight. And in Ireland, that is the thing. We spend from now until January or February, it's pretty dank outside. The fact that we can't go and interact with people because of COVID-19 makes it more difficult. So people are going to put on weight and they're going to worry about that. They want to be healthy. And, Operation Transformation is something that they invest a lot of money in. It hits a lot of people. But it is grounded in something that is heavily aligned with public health guidelines. They're not going out and telling you to become a vegan, and they're not going out and telling you to eat low carb or whatever. And they're not telling you to adhere to any special diet. What they're doing is saying, here are doctors, here are fitness specialists, and here's their advice, and here's some people who have very specific problems. And here's how you can change your lifestyle. And not every single tactic is going to work for everybody, but some will. And I think the role of the broadcaster is to mediate between those things and help the public arrive at a place that's informed for their decision making. So I guess that's what I would say there, Peter. Will it ever happen that each user requires a license to use the relevant social media app? Will it ever happen? I could see how specific social media, I could see how you could arrive at a social media platform that was exclusive in terms of the functionality that you might have. But then it wouldn't be an open network. So I think one of the problems is that people think about social media as one thing. So not all social media is open. So Twitter is an open network. I can broadcast to everybody. I can follow largely anybody and they can follow me. And I don't have to follow them. I can just look for hashtags and see what they're tweeting if it's public. Facebook is a closed social network largely in that we identify who we are and we identify who we want to talk to and who we want to be friends with. And in that respect, we identify who we want to share information with and who we don't. So we set those rules. So in that context, one of the building blocks of social media is control. And what Joe's really asking there is, can I see a situation where the control is set by the social media platform and that they rigorously monitor that? But that doesn't necessarily scale. And so I think that the issue there is the commercial model would then become more that the social media platform would be a broadcaster. But Patreon effectively is a type of platform, and where you only really make money if lots of people want to buy your content, But I do think that if it was at the point where you were vetted before you could post, it'd be less like a social media platform and more like a exclusive dating agency where you were only letting certain people talk to other people. Not so sure it's a good thing, but it could be a model. Carl's asking, do I think platforms like Facebook, Instagram, for example, need to attach credible dietary information on posts about diets like they attach who information? Yes, is the answer to, particularly I think Instagram. Like food is an overwhelming category on Instagram. And so I think that people are heavily influenced by what they see. Possibly some of the fitness images need to be X-rated in a different type of way. But I think that, I think that if you're recommending a lifestyle for a specific health outcome, I think there should be some guidance on that. So I'm being quite specific there. I'm saying is, if you say this diet will help you cure cancer, I think that has to have a warning attached to it, or some evidence supporting that claim. If you think this diet will, so if it cures disease, definitely, this diet is really healthy. It's the best, most healthy thing ever. I think, there's limitations on that. Not every diet is healthy for every person. Like, let's, for example, have an all dairy diet. Now, for me, I'm lactose intolerant. That will be not only detritus to my health, but to my family. I mean, I don't know how they would live with me, right? Personally, I don't think I would last very long. But the key thing there is that the difference with diet is you stick it in your body, you put food in your body. So you're actually saying to people, put this in your body, and this is what the outcome is. I think that people have to be very, very careful about that. So if there's anything that restricts, restrictions on diet, or anything that's saying eat more of something without any clear benefits, I think there should be gatekeepers on it. I don't think it's easy, so I think it's a big problem. But I think the platforms should take that problem as seriously as they take political engagement, etc. I think it's incredibly important. Do you see platforms such as Twitter taking a more active role in this? I'd like to think they are. I don't think they are. I think they're very focused at the moment on identifying extremism, identifying political misinformation, than they are in terms of health. Now, they are doing some work on health, but it's mostly around the sharing of extremely, like, for instance, could they be doing more on bullying? Yes, and they are trying to address bullying, and bullying results in a health effect. I mean, people get depressed, commit suicide, there's a whole variety. So they are doing that. Are they doing stuff on nutrition and diet? No. And the reason they're not doing stuff on nutrition and diet is probably not a conscious reason. It's just that in the ranking of problems that they need to address, whether it's bullying, extremism, political manipulation, I guess it's way down the list. On the same time, I think they are doing stuff, but they could do more. And I think in particular, Instagram and Facebook probably need to focus more on it, because they're sharing a lot of content and TikTok. And the reason I say TikTok is that their influence on kids is dramatic. So anywhere where you have influencers and people want to be like those influencers, and they present some kind of health behavior or nutrition lifestyle or whatever as the means of achieving this fame and fortune, I think that needs to come with some more health warnings. But equally, I think it's wrong to hold social media platforms or any digital platform accountable and responsible for what should be a social activity. We should be teaching our kids and our students, each other, we should be educating the population so that they're not impacted by these things. But again, you go back to this point, is it's a deeply psychological thing. People want to be they want to be popular, and they want to be famous, and they want to earn money, and they see these kids on TikTok, or they see stuff on Snapchat or Instagram or whatever it is this week, and they see these things, and they say, oh, I could be that person. I can dance. I can come up with these dances. And I think that's, massively compelling. And they say, well, if I lose weight, I can. I go to Japan and China a lot, and you see these people bleaching their skin so they look more like Western people. So people will do things because of how they perceive themselves, how other people perceive them, and how they feel that will help them progress in whatever way they want. And I just think it's to do with society in the first instance, and how parents spend time with their kids, and how we educate people in schools, and how we educate people in universities and others about not only digital literacy, not only health literacy, but again, digital health literacy, and actually being satisfied with your lot in life in one sense. Ashling asks, do you think disclaimers with external links actually achieve the set objectives? The answer is no. Okay, so are we asking you like to click out of the social platform to read these notes? Yeah, I don't think they're useful. I think that the disclaimer needs to come contemporaneously with the message or before the message. So a good example would be, if you search for something, go to click on a website that doesn't have a secure SSL, secure HTTP website, Google will put up a message before you get to that website saying, this website might not be secure for the following reasons. Do you want to proceed? So that's a very good example of deterring someone from doing something that may be adverse for them. In this particular context, people put out content, and thousands, if not millions, of people can see that content before the platform might intervene. And I think that what we need to do is, there is extreme cases where it is extremely poor quality content, and we have to intervene to stop that before it reaches any kind of audience. And then there's content that needs warnings. So it could be a visual warning. So it could be a display. And then there's content which may just require some fact checking or corrections. The key thing here is we need to test what works. So we know that in political situations, what works is warnings and stuff, but it has to be at the same time that the message comes out. Ellen says, do you think that members of the plus size body positive community are contributing to the problem of obesity worldwide, or are they teaching us that obesity isn't always necessarily linked to diet? For example, certain pills can cause one to gain weight. So that is a very loaded question. So, so the answer to that is, do members of the plus size are they contributing to the problem of obesity? I don't know is the answer to that, and worldwide, I don't know. I think body positivity is generally a good thing. I think obesity isn't always necessarily linked to diet, so that's an important thing. On the other hand, for the vast majority of people, having a weight within certain parameters is more healthy for you than not. Okay, and I think also obesity is to do with nutrition and what you eat. And so you can be heavy and healthy, okay, but for the majority of people, and remember, when public policy and public communications, we are dealing with large bodies of people. I think that we have to think about, well, what is the policy for most people? And I think that there's a tension between body positivity and negativity, and public health and nutrition, diet, etc. And when I say diet, I don't mean losing weight. I mean, by diet, I mean your regime of eating. I think that there's a difference between people influencing people to feel good about themselves, and then there's people who feel, being healthier. The goal here is, how do we make people feel healthier, and who is influencing people in their diet and nutrition behaviours, and whether those influencers are in line with the public health guidelines in place at any given time. So obviously, if we go back 50, 60 years, I remember there was ads for Guinness. Guinness is good for you, and doctors say it's good for you. Or there was tobacco ads and cigarette ads where they had doctors saying smoking is good for you. Clearly now we know that they're not good for you. My concern is not that if you're on a low carb, high protein diet, I'm not saying that is bad for everybody. What I'm saying is that special diets like keto, etc., those special diets in some cases have adverse effects on people's health, and that's not as straightforward as people make out. Okay, so is that all the questions? Great, no open questions. I'd just like to apologize for the slides transitioning so quickly for everybody. It forced me into talking a bit faster than I anticipated, which may be a good thing. And also that some of the slides weren't presented the way they were designed. So again, we will make those available to people at a later point in time. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, David and Molly. And thank you for joining in.
All right, so with no further questions, we'll come to a close. I'd like to thank Professor Lynn for his insightful and very interesting presentation, and to everyone for their participation and attendance today. Transform Health will continue again tomorrow at the same time. Joining us tomorrow will be Stephen Daniels, one of our colleagues here in DCU, and Ken Cowell of Silver Cloud Healthcare. One other note for your diary. The next Transform event will be Get Started, and that will run from November the 16th to the 20th, every day from 1 to 2 p.m. We'll be circulating the registration link across the DCU Business School and .lab channels for anyone who'd like to join us. So in the meantime, thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Bye.